Good afternoon. My name is Kara Logston. I'm the Community and Audiovisual Services Coordinator here at the Iowa City Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to our final 2002 Carol Spaziani Intellectual Freedom Festival program. We are live on the library channel, and it's with all of our Intellectual Freedom Festival programs. The program will be recorded and replayed on the library channel, so if you want to catch it again, you'll be able to. The topic today is government secrecy and national security. And before we get started, I'd actually like to direct you to a display that we have out on the first floor of the library. It's a display of the November 1979 issue of the Progressive. There's also a handout over on the table that's the cover of one of the Progressive articles that we'll be referring to today. And the URL for getting the full text of this article, or actually the entire issue of the Progressive, is written down at the bottom. And let me read that for the people at home. It's www.progressive.org/pdf/1179.pdf. So you can access the full text of this. We have two speakers today, Dr. Carolyn Stewart-Dyer and Dr. Lar Fortes. Carolyn, I'll introduce Carolyn first and then Lar. Carolyn is in her 25th year on the faculty at the University of Iowa School of Journalism and Mass Communication, where she teaches media law and advanced reporting, as well as other related subjects. Carolyn has a PhD in mass communication with a minor in law from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. When she was at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the early 1970s, freedom of political expression was an issue of everyday concern. The Progressive case, the topic of today's discussion, actually developed in Madison. Carolyn first studied the Progressive case when it began in 1979. She taught the case for many years, and her interest was renewed in the past few years when she learned that her family was actually directly affected by the secrecy the Progressive magazine exposed in the H-bomb article. It was heightened when the current administration began removing information from public access and reclassifying it in the name of national security after September 11th. And I love this part of Carolyn. She's an expert on Nancy Drew. And she's promised me that she will come and do a Nancy Drew program one year, and I think I'll hold her to that promise. Our other speaker today is Dr. Lawrence Fortes. He's a professor in the Department of Occupational and Environmental Health at the University of Iowa. He teaches environmental toxicology and international health, and his current research interests are injury epidemiology, occupational epidemiology, and the DOE, Department of Energy Former Worker Program. He serves as the project director for the federally funded Burlington Atomic Energy Commission Plant Former Worker Program. And actually, I'm going to read the description of this program as an introduction for you. This is from the University of Iowa's Public Health webpage. The Burlington Atomic Energy Commission Plant Former Worker Program is a medical screening program being carried out by the University of Iowa College of Public Health and funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. In 1993, Congress passed Public Law 102-484, a section of this law requiring the DOE, formerly known as the Atomic Energy Commission, to screen for occupational health conditions among former employees who may be at risk for such health problems as a result of their employment at DOE sites, including a subset of the workforce at the Iowa Army Ammunition Plant near Burlington. And that's IAAP. That plant manufactured high explosive components for nuclear weapons, as well as performed the final assembly of the weapons during the years of 1949 to 1975. The DOE contracted with the University of Iowa in August 2000 to carry out this project in Iowa. The goal of the project is to identify and locate those individuals who are employed by the AEC at the Burlington plant in order to subsequently offer them medical screenings and assist the process of filing relevant claims under the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program. So I'll turn the program over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the Carol Spaziani Intellectual Freedom Festival again. I was invited to talk about a current issue, a number of which were suggested: the USA Patriot Act, the Child Internet Protection Act, government printing issues and documents recalled, or other hot issues. I've chosen a topic that relates to the Patriot Act and various government agencies' decisions to recall documents from the web and orders to destroy documents in federal depository libraries. But rather than focus on these issues directly, or at least at any length, I'm going to go back to an earlier war and older fears and threats to national security, and attempts by the government to control access to information. I want to resurrect the 1979 case in which the Department of Justice went to court to prevent a liberal magazine from publishing the article entitled "The H-Bomb Secret: How We Got It and Why We're Telling It." A federal district court in Madison, Wisconsin issued an order that delayed publication for more than 6 months. That was the longest-running government restraint on publication in U.S. history, before or since. Perhaps the last gasp of the Cold War restrictions on freedom of expression. I want to look at the case, the issue of government secrecy, then some consequences of eventually publishing the article, and implications in the current climate of fear about national security. Some background about the Progressive magazine. I have a couple copies over here in addition to the display outside of the magazine that contained the article in question, and an earlier issue that came out the month that they were planning to publish the article about, and it's about the article but doesn't include it. The Progressive magazine was founded in the 1920s by Progressive Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. It has continued as a watchdog from the left on public affairs, particularly issues of war and peace and social justice. In the late 1970s, a former editor of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists became the managing editor and joined a longtime liberal editor, Erwin Knoll. They decided to run a series on atomic energy, including one article based on an amateur researcher's effort to find out whether there was, in fact, any secret about how the H-bomb worked and what triggered the explosion. Knoll and Day believed there were no secrets in the scientific world, and also believed that the Cold War, the McCarthy witch hunts, blacklisting of people in the entertainment industry, and prosecutions were all based on the myth of a secret. They believed that the myth hid important information from the public, prevented the public participation in making policy regarding nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. Freelance writer, and anti-nuclear activist Howard Moreland was hired to try to learn the so-called H-bomb secret and to write an article about it. He searched in public libraries, encyclopedias, Encyclopedia Americana, for example, his college physics book, documents on the open shelves of the Los Alamos Facility Library. He interviewed nuclear scientists and officials in the Department of Energy who knew what he was doing and complied. He also filled in some gaps with educated guesses or speculations. His story described how an H-bomb was constructed, the materials it was made of, and where they were made and processed into parts for the bomb, and how easy it was to get the information. The point Moreland made was that there was no secret among scientists, and that the secrecy prevented Congress from exercising reasonable oversight of the bomb-making process and prevented the public from participating in debate about nuclear policy. It also prevented workers and neighbors from knowing about the dangerous materials they were handling. Moreland checked the accuracy of his article and the diagrams he drew with knowledgeable people. When it came to putting the story in the newspaper, the editors finally got cold feet, and they wanted their own assurance that the information in the article was scientifically accurate. If they were going to say this is the secret about the H-bomb, they wanted to make sure they had it right. And so Sam Day, who'd been working at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, sent the article to an acquaintance in the Department of Energy who he thought he could trust. That person quickly circulated it among energy agencies and cabinet members, and with the encouragement of President Jimmy Carter and at the urgent request of the Secretaries of State and Energy and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, the Attorney General moved to stop publication in a case that's called USA versus the Progressive. Most cases are called US versus something if they involve the government, but this one actually is called the United States of America versus the Progressive, and I think that's not a mistake, or was not an accident. The government sought a temporary restraining order and then an injunction under a never-used provision of the Atomic Energy Act, which prohibited disclosure of so-called restricted data. Restricted data is defined in the law as data about the design, manufacture, or utilization of atomic weapons, the production of special nuclear material, or the use of special nuclear material in the production of energy. Such information is said to be born secret, and it is restricted until it is declassified, regardless of where it comes from, even if it's made up of unclassified information. During the hearings on the case, it became clear that even Moreland's speculations and ideas constituted restricted data, that he didn't own it and couldn't use it. The government argued that Moreland's article would make it easier for nations on the brink of developing an H-bomb to do so quickly, if it were published. The Progressives' attorneys and expert witnesses had security clearances, but the staff did not, so they were not in on much of the activity in the case. The government offered to negotiate with the Progressive to remove restricted data from the article and permit it to be published, but they would not reveal what the restricted data was, and so the Progressive refused. They would have refused anyway. So the injunction stood for 6 months until several other publications, including another alternative publication in Madison, the Madison Press Connection, published similar articles. Within a day after the Madison Press Connection article was published, the government dropped the Progressive case in September 1979. And it took 2 months of lead time to get the article published in the magazine. I've labeled this section "Secrets and Lies." In the aftermath, many disturbing facts came to light. The Secretaries of State and Defense had traveled around the country visiting newspaper editorial boards and warning them not to support the Progressive editorially. As a result, the media, which normally lines up in strict formation whenever censorship is suggested, opposed the Progressive in very strong editorials all over the country. Many in the Justice Department had believed the case was weak from the beginning and should not have been undertaken, but their voices were overruled. Even the conservative judge, who was so fearful of the dangerous information in the article that he did not read it, I don't know whether he thought he would get contaminated by nuclear or radioactive materials or what, but he didn't read it. Even he concluded that the government had lied to him in court. Many of the scientists who opposed the Progressive and served as witnesses for the government came to change their minds and admit that there was no secret. Howard Moreland said later about what he was doing. He was researching nuclear energy and the bomb before the Progressive found him. He said, "My original goal in researching this subject before I joined forces with the Progressive was to produce a graphic image for a slideshow plus a three-dimensional model to serve as a lecture prop. I intended to label each major component with the appropriate corporate logo and tie it to a particular production facility in the Department of Energy complex. The bomb diagram was to serve as an outline for the portrait of an industry." And a lot of that was lost in all of the debate about whether there was prior restraint on the magazine and fear about this information. One thing the case demonstrated that once a case gets into court, it's almost impossible to keep government secrets. a number of documents were declassified after the Progressive case. The government's failure in the case no doubt discouraged it from using the Atomic Energy Act from censoring other publications. Nascent efforts to bring to public attention the effects of nuclear bombs on test site victims and downwinders and of employees and neighbors of weapons and manufacturers and suppliers increased and became more public in the 1980s and 1990s. Although laws and rules and activity didn't directly mention the Progressive case, I don't think the discussion and the debate that led to all these changes could have occurred without the Progressive case. One long delayed consequence was the adoption of the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Program in 2000, which Dr. Fuartes will talk about, to cover people injured by radioactive and other substances while they were working for Department of Energy facilities. In part, it was made possible by the investigative reporting of a Toledo Blade reporter who used the Freedom of Information Act to gain access to many documents on the weapons industry. I just learned from Lara Fuartes that this reporter is coming here next April, worked as a secretary to Mildred Benson, who wrote the Nancy Drew books. I discovered him when I was reading the Toledo Blade online to read Mildred Benson's column, and as I'll explain in a minute, ran across a series that he wrote. I have a personal interest in this law because my stepfather and his first wife both worked in the 1940s for an energy contractor in Ohio that processed beryllium, a metal used in the so-called trigger of the H-bomb. My stepfather is a chemist, and he knew something about beryllium. When his wife became disabled by a lung disease in the mid-1950s, he was able to find the person who was probably the #1 expert on chronic beryllium disease in the country to be her physician. But she spent more than 15 years severely ill, much of it tied to an oxygen tank, and died of the disease in 1968. As a result of the Energy Employees Law, he was finally compensated for her death just last month. Today is his 83rd birthday, and he's in a nursing home. Even this law, late as it is, does not address illnesses and death suffered by others affected by the arms race and continued manufacture as well as dismantling and storage of nuclear weapons and substances. Once again, we are in a period in which the government is fanning the fires of fear following 9/11 and preparing for war. It appears that truth will again be the first casualty as the administration closes ranks and shuts down access to information about national security, defense, and related subjects, and gives itself power to investigate information-gathering activities of private individuals in libraries and bookstores and other places. Just a few examples. The USA Patriot Act expands the government's authority to conduct surveillance of use of library computers and to request libraries for records pertaining to users. Under a new order on the Freedom of Information Act, the Attorney General encourages government agencies to classify or reclassify information pertaining to national security, law enforcement, sensitive business information, like perhaps these government contractors that my stepfather worked for, and protection of individual privacy. He also suggests that they explore all possible exemptions when someone requests information and assures the record holders that the Justice Department will back them in any suit by a person seeking information. A White House memo has restricted sensitive but not classified information, and the proposed Homeland Security bill would enact this into law. There's not a very good definition of sensitive information. Without a definition, that means the record keepers can make it up on the spot. At least one government agency has requested that the United States Geological Survey information regarding water supplies be removed from the federal depository libraries. And there are fears that other documents will be slated for removal. And those documents serve as our history of what the government has been doing. Once they're removed, they're gone forever. Another order extends the period during which a former president's papers are closed to requests that would involve so-called state secrets. Many departments have removed thousands of documents from their websites since 9/11. Others now require a person to apply for permission to access the information and request a great deal of personal information in order to qualify to get that access. And then you can use it only for what they determine are legitimate uses. These and other efforts or actions to make public information secret provide the basis for new Cold War type powers, investigations, and threats to ordinary citizens, in my view. Perhaps of greater concern is that recent polls show that the public is increasingly willing to trade what passes for security for freedom of expression or information. About half of those polled by the First Amendment Center said the press has been too aggressive in asking the government for information about the war on terrorism. About the same percentage said the First Amendment gives us too much freedom. And 40% said newspapers should not be allowed to freely criticize the U.S. military about strategy and performance. So the impact of this case, at least as I trace it, is that some attitudes that were present are repeating themselves, or it's not the impact, they are repeating themselves, and we seem to have forgotten that it's hard to keep secrets, and doing so can be harmful. Thanks.
That was a great overview of the issue of censorship, and I'm going to be talking really more about anecdotes, the personal stories, and the history of the atom bomb is a history of an incredible period and evolution of science. The turn of the century was a time when people were coming up with incredible ideas, earth-shattering, people said, new paradigms in physics, the recognition of quantum mechanics, and people were sharing ideas freely. So this is a very interesting transition of now the legacy of secrecy that we're dealing with because of the Cold War. But to tell you of our introduction to this process, what occurred historically was a employee at this facility just 2 hours south of here. He was a guard who was responsible for receiving the fissile materials, the uranium or later plutonium that arrived from Los Alamos or other sites. He would receive these and supervise their storage, transfer, and storage. And in the late 1980s, he developed a disease called Nonhodgkins lymphoma and felt that this was bad luck, but then he looked around his coworkers and found that there were at least half a dozen other cases of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in his coworkers. Became concerned that this might be occupational, called around to friends in other atomic energy facilities around the country, and they said to him, well, why aren't you part of the surveillance project? This was just in 1999 that he started making these calls, and said, what surveillance project? And they said, well, everybody in the old AEC workforce is undergoing cancer screenings, and they should be looking at your health and your coworkers' health to address this concern. So he contacted the Department of Energy and Senator Harkin's office, and the first response that they got was, what atomic bomb facility in Iowa? This facility was top secret. It was one of the most secret facilities in the country because it was, for several years, the only place where you could drive up with a truck to a loading dock and leave with a finished, usable atomic weapon. And in 1979, as Kara said, in 1979, this facility closed. Atomic weapons manufacture didn't stop. They shipped the facility to Amarillo, Texas, a place called Pantex. So what happened was from 1975 to 1999, there was really a generational change. The Atomic Energy Commission no longer existed. It was now called the Department of Energy. It had other responsibilities in addition to nuclear fuel, oil, electricity, other things were not part of their mandate. And there weren't living and working in that administration or that agency anymore people who worked with the Burlington facility. So they said, and I guess we have to believe them, the people who were spoken to said they had not heard of a Burlington facility. Curious, because we got the yearly reports from the Department of Energy showing the Atomic Energy Commission work history, and they have a huge map with little dots and symbols of all the activities around the country, and right smack dab in the center is one of two little symbols of an atomic bomb, one over Burlington and one over Amarillo. So somebody knew enough to get the map right. Another anecdote about that transparency, I mean, that's the new phrase in government now, is transparency, and recognizing that if you keep secrets, you increase your liability. If you just look at how the University of Iowa comports its business when it comes to environmental issues, you'll see that this is something that we all need to learn. Every agency needs to learn how to be more transparent and to be less defensive, to learn when to say, I'm sorry, and what are the next steps. That's what President Clinton decided that the Department of Energy had to do. He's decided that the Department of Energy had to recognize the amassing data that suggested that workers who worked in and around atomic weapons facilities were dying of increased rates of a variety of cancers and lung conditions. So the science was amassing and saying that this workforce, which is quite large, 500,000 people around the country at least, was dying at elevated rates. When they told us in the year 2000 you should look at the health of the workforce in Burlington, we met with people in the plant and we met with the government agents who were running the plant. These are now Department of Defense employees. Talked to the head health and safety worker who said to us, and I'll say it at 16 to 33 RPM, but you try to hear it at 78 RPM, okay? Because they say it so often it comes out at 78 RPM. He said, we can neither confirm nor deny the presence nor absence of fissile materials on this plant. Sir! And he really did say it at 78 RPM. I had to say, come again? And that's something that the Department of Defense still hasn't come to the point of realizing the need for transparency in all their activities. They are getting much better about it, however, at environmental impact issues. In fact, here in Burlington, they've been doing a Superfund cleanup because of the Department of Defense activities for over a decade, spending between $2 and $10 million a year on analyzing risks associated with this industry, the potential for off-site contamination, and hopefully looking at potential health hazards associated with this. When we first started collecting the histories of the workers in this facility, one of the most common stories we would hear was people would say, well, you know, most of what we did industrially was high explosives manufacture because the fissile materials, the plutonium, for example, would arrive in something like a bowling ball, and our job was to make a high explosive lens around it, something that would cause the two subcritical masses of a fissile element to compact with great force. So they would surround this with two hemispheres of high explosives. And they made tons and tons of high explosives at this facility, not just for nuclear weapons, but also for conventional weapons. They made Patriot missiles and hand grenades and other sorts of high explosives there, conventional munitions. They told us repeatedly, many people, that you could always tell somebody who worked directly with high explosives because they would turn blonde. and their skin would turn yellow. So you could see somebody across the street or across the grocery store, and you'd know that they were working in high explosives. So you know that exposures were significant enough that people's skin and hair were getting dyed from high explosives. These are TNT derivatives. And there were also stories of, for decades, that they said the river ran red. Not talking metaphorically or talking about blood associated with this industry, talking about the waste of TNT. All the TNT had to be milled to very, very high tolerances or very specified thicknesses and masses for these atomic weapons. And all the milling was done underwater, so lots of water was used in the process. And if there were any bubbles in the high explosives, the whole thing had to be redone. And so they threw away tons and tons of wastewater onto the surface, which went into the creeks, which resulted in the Skunk River running red and being essentially sterile or devoid of large life forms for a good decade or so. So they are doing that sort of environmental cleanup, and actually the Department of Defense is doing this around the country. There are a lot of these facilities where they have Superfund sites. Our responsibility is looking after workers' health issues. And the story you told about your stepfather's first wife is kind of a classic story. Talk about a workforce that worked from 1945 or 49 through 1975 with atomic weapons. If they got ill with serious occupational diseases, where do you think they are? They're buried now, right? So what we're seeing are the survivors. Probably quite a few people suffered occupational diseases, and that's going to be a very difficult task to uncover. One of the things that we believe is critical in this project is, in terms of transparency and healing in the community, is trying to find out exactly what happened and share that information with the community. When we have public meetings like this, there may be this few, but there may be 300, 400 people in a room. And one of the most common things that you experience is grief. People saying, so many of my loved ones, my parents, my coworkers, et cetera, died. If we show up with a roster of employees and go through the roster with individuals, a good half of the workers have died. It's not to say they died of occupational diseases. My goodness, these are people who might have started work in their 20s in 1945. Okay, so these are people who are approaching their life expectancy. That's one issue, so there's going to be a difficulty in terms of going back in time. But also there is a suspicion that these people were exposed to sufficient quantities of a variety of toxins. We know the high explosives were not adequately controlled. The exposures were not adequately controlled if people turned yellow. In addition, they work with fissile materials, fissile meaning radioactive and potentially explosive through a chain reaction. These workers worked in bays underground. Could be a room about a quarter of, or about half of this size, where there'd be 2 surgical tables, and they would work for an unspecified period of time assembling or disassembling and revamping these atomic weapons. The atomic weapons, if you look on the internet, you can see a very simple schematic of how the atomic weapons are made. 2 subcritical masses, explosive around those subcritical masses, and then what? And then what was a lot of high-tech electromechanical engineering. They had to have sensors, they had to have timing systems and altitude sensors and heat sensors and vibration sensors and all these sorts of things, all kinds of fail-safes that the first weapons didn't have. So there was a lot of recycling of these materials and revamping and improvement of the technology over time. So people were working at waist height within a couple of feet of these fissile elements. They were very, very close to this radioactive material. And there is a big controversy. There's a lot of scientific conjecture regarding the significance of exposure to these radioactive materials, uranium and plutonium, with such proximity. We really don't have the answers to what those risks are, but we're 2 years later always making tiny little steps forward and trying to get that information. Another exposure, in addition to high explosives and radiation, which is relatively specific to this workforce, is the metal that you were talking about, beryllium. beryllium is a high-tech metal that has a variety of uses in explosives industry. On the periodic table, beryllium is number 4. It's a very light metal. It's very light. It's the lightest metal with the densest nucleus. So it has a very dense nucleus being on that end of the periodic table, and as such, it acts as what's called a neutron mirror. And the way the chain reaction occurs is when you put these two subcritical masses together, the nuclei start to shed neutrons, and if they hit an adjacent nucleus, they can shed 2 neutrons, and if each one hits another one and sheds 2 more, that's an exponential increase in neutron release. That's the chain reaction that results in very rapid release of a lot of energy. Beryllium is used as a shell to encase those fissile materials, and it acts as a neutron mirror. So the neutrons don't escape outside that shell. They bounce back in, and you increase the rate of that chain reaction. So that's one of the uses, was specific to that core of the nuclear weapon. But in addition, they had to do all kinds of machining to get precise thicknesses and masses of high explosives. You can imagine machining of high explosives seems to be a dangerous thing to do. You machine things, there's vibration, there's heat, there's the potential for explosion. They were very careful in the machining process to try to do it underwater. That should minimize risk. They were also very careful to minimize sparks, to minimize electrostatic energy release. So people wore little booties, they still do, wear little booties that act as grounding to decrease their static electricity. And every tool that is used in this industry is a spark-free tool. And what they used was copper beryllium alloy. Copper is a very soft metal. It's virtually useless for hammers, screwdrivers, drills, etc. But if you add 1% or so of beryllium to that copper, you now have a very hard copper-colored tool. So all the hammers, screwdrivers, drills, etc. that were used in the facility and are used in these high explosives facilities pretty much are copper beryllium alloys. So people might polish those tools or grind those tools or sharpen those tools. The screwdrivers might get blunt ends, and a machinist might have taken those to a lathe. In terms of the secrecy and how it affected this workforce, typically workers don't know what they're exposed to. The era of transparency in the workforce is really quite new. This is the result of what was called the right to know legislation. I don't know if you all know the history of the right to know legislation, but people used to have a fairly paternalistic, I guess they still do, attitude towards workers and felt that we would take responsibility for health and safety, et cetera, and the workers don't need to know. And what happened was, not quite 15 years ago, a couple of Polish immigrants in the Chicago suburbs were recycling X-ray film. They used cyanide acid baths to reclaim the silver. And the cyanide mixed with the acid in the bath water and released hydrogen cyanide, and these guys died in the garage that they were doing this in. And what came out of this was the workers' right to know legislation. This was a big lawsuit where people tried to bring to court the CEO of this small industry, who ended up fleeing to a foreign country, Utah, and has been fighting extradition ever since. In terms of just workers' health issues, then I'm going to open it up for questions. We said that we're now looking at the survivors, we're looking at occupational lung diseases and cancers. One thing I think that we should all be getting up in arms about, this small workforce does have a legal remedy for certain diseases that they might develop. So beryllium lung disease is something that they might be compensated for by the federal government, because beryllium was used in this Department of Energy process, fairly specific to that process. I don't know if any of you have experienced this in your families, but anybody who develops an occupational cancer, let's say they develop asbestosis in Iowa, and they're diagnosed at age 70, and they see their doctor and they find scarring of the lung, and then they die at age 75 of lung cancer from asbestosis and smoking. They have no legal remedy. Workers' compensation in many states will only pay for diseases that manifest within a year of their last exposure. which means that chronic diseases, kidney failure, lung disease, cancers, which typically manifest in the elderly, aren't compensable. So that's a separate issue from the freedom of information issue, the transparency issue, but it's a human rights issue that I think you should all be aware of, and it's highly relevant to what we're doing in this workforce. Thank you very much.
Are there questions? Yes.
You paint a picture of a Department of Defense which is remarkably liberal in its present concern for worker health, etc., which is directly opposite to what the people are doing at the top with other kinds of information. It is quite true that this administration is the most niggardly with putting out information of any that we have ever seen. But apparently defense is going its own way?
It's a big industry. The Department of Defense is a big industry with many service units, and I can't speak for everyone. I can only say that what I've been seeing is that over the last 15 years, because they've been led into this issue through the courts, and because the legacy of contamination from their explosive industries has really wreaked havoc. The rivers ran red and such. The EPA has gotten on board, and so the EPA and public citizenry have sued the Department of Defense. So they've needed to operate transparently in terms of environmental contamination, off-site environmental contamination. On the reservations, probably nobody has jurisdiction. That would take an act of Congress probably to get on site for some of these issues. But the EPA is that agency. And so that EPA has been looking at what is the contamination of that industry and how is it getting off site and what needs to be done to remedy it. So that's one issue. In terms of workers' health, so that may be novel to my experience, but the people who I am working with in the Center for Health Promotion and Preventive Medicine in the Army are they're all physicians and public health physicians, and the Army really does have an incredible history in public health. The Army has really been, the military has been the group that has learned how to transport young people across borders, how to keep their water separate from their sewage, how to give them enough food, how to keep their air relatively safe, be it in submarines or airplanes or what have you. So public health is really something that the military does quite well. Workers' health, be it the enlisted men or be it contractors, there is certainly going to be a patchwork of experiences that individuals have. But I'm seeing at least what appears to me to be a change towards transparency, a trend towards that.
Dee?
Lars, you seem to imply that they're doing a pretty good job of cleanup, but I read the government accounting office reports on the DOE and on the cleanup of DOE facilities and Army and military facilities in general. I mean, where they're storing old airplanes and oil was dumped in ditches for years. And many of these sites are not being properly attacked. The EPA doesn't really have full control over military cleanup.
Yes.
And so it falls to the bottom of the list of priorities. So I would argue that the cleanup, at least can't cite exact data, but that the cleanup isn't going nearly as well as it seems to be implied.
And I'm relatively ignorant of this, and I didn't say the cleanup is going well, actually. What I said is they're spending tens of millions of dollars a year because I can't make that judgment.
Hanford alone would take all the money you got.
Or Rocky Flats.
You're right, and there are many such industries, and there are many that have not even been looked at. There are places where they're saying, well, there's so much contamination, we're really just going to leave it lie.
That's right, Ohio's got a bunch of them, for example. As you already know, well known. Or Oak Ridge, or forget it, it's Savannah River, the whole pile.
Are there other questions? Yes, Holly?
Yeah, if we're talking about national security, I'm surprised that the Bush administration devaluing public health and the economic value of public health. Because most economic models don't put economic value on public health. So I would urge you to slant the argument for further funding or.
Yeah, there's two interesting issues. One is, in times of crisis, public health tends to do relatively well. So if you have an HIV crisis that's recognized, that may increase funding. If you have a bio or chemical terrorism crisis that's brought to the consciousness of the funding agencies, public health tends to do relatively well. But you have two competing issues, because in public health you need transparency. You need to have access to information. And in a security area, you may have now very conflicting modes of operation, that the people who are given funds for public health labs or what have you may be asked to operate on a different paradigm than they've been used to. So it'll be an interesting time for public health.
Can I address one more question? Carolyn, you're probably more familiar with Jeff Smith's book on openness versus secrecy during war, and maybe you could talk about this, that it seems to me that if you're going to have a functional system, essentially when you're talking about national security, you're talking about a functional system. And it seems to me that the Bush administration is killing the openness that we need for the flows, to keep flows of information, flows of resources, to keep a system functional. And if you close up all those flows of information and resources, then you're going to get an anaerobic system.
That certainly seems to be the observation with the so many bills in Congress and executive orders include in them some kind of limitation to information. The Atomic Energy Act was the first law that authorized the government to censor anything. And now it seems to be much easier to propose that or adopt that. When the Patriot Act, was passed in a matter of minutes after 9/11, and there was very little chance for scrutiny about the specific contents of it, and it includes a number of things that restrict information.
So at what point are we going to go back and say, especially, I wrote a letter to the editor, or a guest opinion that was published, that I found links between the attempt to cover up the SNL, the Whitewater, and the attempts to cover up the SNL scandals of the 1980s, the greatest fraud in the history of crime, and the link between Enron and 9/11. They occurred about the same time. Was 9/11 an attempt to cover up Enron? Therefore,
I think this is getting a little bit away from our.
It's not. It's dealing with national security and did the oil companies conspire to cause 9/11?
I don't think we have anybody with expertise in this room that can answer that question.
Then why are we so trying to clamp down on the population to stop these flows of information that we need for national security?
I agree with you.
Okay. I have a. Okay, go ahead.
For Carolyn, this is a little broader about the media, and I caught the tail end of an NPR program where they were interviewing a reporter from CNN who was justifying CNN's relationship with the government of Afghanistan to, saying if we didn't have that relationship, well, I guess that he was in, if I remember right, they were in jeopardy of losing this relationship because they'd stepped over the line that government had drawn. And they were trying to toe this line because they wanted to be there if there was a war, or Iraq, and so they wanted to be in the area. But there's our journalists, and I'm sure the same thing happens with our government. Governments draw lines and say, this is what you know, and if you try and find out more, we're not gonna open what we do open to you. And it puts journalists, people who are trying to find the information, in very bad situations, because they have to make that decision. You know, do I push it because there's truth here that needs to get out to people, or do I stay where I am for now because I have to protect some relationship that I have with this governmental entity?
That's a constant dilemma for journalists, and I guess I fear that it's getting worse because the media are becoming so concentrated in ownership, and the companies that own them are not even media companies in many instances, and so news has become a bottom line kind of operation, just like advertising. And so journalists are in a position, are always in a position of not wanting to lose a good source. That's the terminology they use. And with all the kinds of pressures that are on them, the chances of cozying up to anybody, it seemed to me to be much greater. I was surprised to learn, though, that the Defense Department reporters, the military reporters, have recently formed an organization to, interestingly, lobby with the Defense Department to get more information, as opposed to go to court and demand it. Lots of Defense Department information has been taken off their website or been made unavailable. For example, all of they used to have on the website diagrams and descriptive material of all of the military aircraft that journalists use just for ordinary stories, describing, a plane goes down in a training mission, and they could look up there for that kind of information. They don't have that, so they have to guess or try to create it in some other way. But I share your concern, and I think it's more common.
At one point in the Afghan war, near the end of the Afghan war, last years ago, the score was 8 soldiers dead, 8 journalists dead. That didn't make sense at all.
I have a question for Dr. Fortes. How has the flow of information been between you and your patients? I mean, are you allowed to share information for healthcare totally? I thought that I heard something on WSUI about limits that were being placed on the kind of information that you could have regarding what was worked on.
There are a number of flow of information concerns in the project. What was in the media recently was somewhat unfortunate. We were negotiating with the contractor to get access to medical records and plant process and industrial hygiene records, and that's an ongoing negotiation. But there was a major security issue that these people were living under the dread of being potentially tried for treason should they talk about things that they knew regarding how to put together an atomic weapon. There was a process of intense secrecy and what they call need to know, in that people might work adjacent to each other, and one person knows how to screw a screw in one way and one another way, and they don't know what the function is of those 2 screws. And they don't know what's going on in the room before and the room after them. Those sorts of issues were going on as well, to try to keep information flow as secret as possible. But people have been told now from the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the U.S. Congress, and President's Office, I believe, you are free to talk about any health concern associated with your work history. All you cannot do is share with the University of Iowa or other individuals the geometry of an atomic weapon, what mass of high explosive to what mass of fissile material, what kind of wires do you need to use, or what have you. It's really, there is a national security issue, but it's been minimized. There is still, unfortunately, the fear and the concern on the part of the workforce, and a large chunk of the workforce having worked for 50 years, being told, you breathe a word of this and we'll throw you in jail and your family as well, they're reticent to come forward. So there is that legacy of secrecy that I think has affected the communication flow.
One quick
Dee?
question for
Yes.
Carolyn. And maybe you can clarify or help my memory. But in the late 60s, something called the Smythe Report, maybe the early 60s, it came out. It was a pretty complete report, a classified report by Henry Smythe that explained the details of working of the then atomic weapon. There was a small version of it was published and available to the public, not widely, but I got a copy of it. I think about 1965, they gave great details. I still have the thing. I should look at that.
Like to
They
see
gave
it.
great details, and I think the Progressive was publishing something that was already later identified that had already been basically in this document that had been produced by the government, and that they weren't as wild-eyed as had been implied. Did you remember?
I've read about that report. I haven't seen it, but they were publishing information. You know, they put it together in a different way. To some extent, the way any writer would put it together differently from some other writer. But they put together information, a lot of it that was public, and much of it government documents.
It was assembling stuff, yeah, I thought that was the bad, yeah. I expect you still get the picture.
Yeah, the politics of it are a little confusing because the case occurred with the blessing of President Carter, but he was a nuclear engineer. And the judge in charge was just coincidentally the last appointment of Richard Nixon before he got in the helicopter and flew off, and was very conservative and not very smart. I covered him when he was in the state legislature in Wisconsin before he became a judge. But I don't know, the politics are somewhat hard to figure out. But the Carter administration did a number of interesting things having to do with nuclear energy that probably had something to do with Carter's own profession.
There's a question right here.
Wasn't the Smythe report very early and wasn't it only about fission bombs?
It was only about fission, but, yeah.
And this is a fusion bomb.
Fusion, yeah.
This was only about fission at that time, but the ideas about fusion were pretty clear. The details, as Barr says, are still hard to get because of the sophistication of the deal.
Additional questions? If not, I think we'll close. Our speakers today have been Dr. Carolyn Stewart-Dyer and Dr. Lar Fuertes from the University of Iowa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.